On this episode, we are talking about fine motor problems, and I want to give you 2 at-home tests you can try on your kids if they're struggling with fine motor problems that could potentially shine some light on underlying issues going on.
Angel. I got my city doing front flips when every father mayor rapper jump ship.
My goal of this video is just to briefly cover 2 things that could be contributing to your child with fine motor problems, whether they can't grip a pencil correctly or write or draw, maybe they can't use scissors the way that they should, or they have trouble getting dressed because of buttons and zippers, whatever the problem is. I want to go over the 2 most common culprits that I've found in practice since starting that kids with fine motor problems have. First thing that I'm going to go over is retained primitive reflexes. And if you follow my stuff, you're probably almost getting tired of me talking about retained primitive reflexes, but it's such an important topic that I am always going to go back to it. It's a core part of my content. But for those of you that don't know what a retained primitive reflex is, everyone is born with primitive reflexes, and they're there initially to give feedback to our brain and to kind of help it get going. It's like our kickstart, it's our training wheels. It gives feedback to the brain. And then by about 6 months of age, your brain should be mature enough at that point to where it doesn't need these reflexes anymore, and it can get rid of them. And once it gets rid of them, it can start doing more complex things. But a lot of these kids retain onto these reflexes and they never fully get rid of them. And what that's saying is it's a window in saying that the brain stem is in kind of a weakened or immature state. So what you need to do is be able to strengthen that part of the brain, get rid of the reflexes, so then your brain can continue to do more complex things. There are several different kinds of primitive reflexes, but the one we're specifically talking about today is the Palmar reflex, P-A-L-M-A-R reflex. And a lot of you already know what this reflex is inherently, you just didn't know it was called a Palmar reflex. If you ever are by a baby and they have their hand out and you put your finger in their hand, they always clench down. And that's the Palmar reflex. So what we're going to be looking at is that specific reflex today, and if your child retains onto that past that 6 to 12 month mark, there can be negative effects with fine motor coordination, with speech, articulation. So we want to make sure that that Palmar reflex is not there, and if it is, we want to get rid of it. The long-term effects of having and holding on to this Palmar reflex is a lack of manual dexterity, a lack of a pincer grip, which is going to affect how you hold a pencil and your fine motor problems with that. It can affect speech. It can affect hypersensitivity of the palm to different stimuli. It can affect a lot of these kids with the Palmar reflex. They will move their mouth or have mouth movements when they're writing or drawing, or they might stick their tongue out and things like that, because there's a lot of connections between the mouth and hand. The way that you test for this reflex is very simple. It's just like you would with a baby when their hand was like this and you put their hand, except what you're going to want to do is make sure that your kid's hand is flat. So make sure that their arm or their fingers aren't already curled up. Make sure that they're flat, and then what you're going to want to do is brush along the creases of their palm. So when you do that, if they remain straight like this, then there's no Palmar reflex. But if you start brushing like this and then they start curling in their hands and start making it towards a fist, that's going to mean that they still have the retained primitive reflex. And you can try it on both hands. Usually if they have it, they'll start bringing down their hands. So if they have that, that's the thing that you're going to want to get rid of to increase that fine motor coordination. The second thing that we're going to go over today is proprioception. So proprioception is a very big fancy word, basically saying that your brain knows where your body's at in space. So if I take my finger, and I can see it here, but if I put it out of my field of view, I still know exactly where it's at, right? And that's at its most basic form, that's what proprioception is. It allows our brain to know where our body's at in space. And a lot of these kids with fine motor problems, they have a decreased amount of proprioception going to the brain. If there's a lowered amount of proprioception going to the brain, that's not going to allow your brain to have the most crystal clear picture of where your finger's at in space. So that's why it's going to affect things like buttoning and zipping and drawing and things like that. The quickest way you can test for proprioception is you're going to put your arms out to the side and you're going to have your pointer fingers pointing out. And then you're going to slowly bring them up over your head and you're going to touch your fingers together over top. So what happens is, if you can come over top and touch the fingers together, that means that your proprioception is pretty good. And if you, let me just show you here, I'll back up. So if I'm in frame here, so I'm going to start out here, come over top, and touch my fingers together. So that would be equivalent of having good proprioception. But if your child, I'll sink down a little bit, if they keep coming over top and they keep missing, that's basically saying that they have a decreased amount of proprioception going to the brain, and that needs to be able to increase, because what that's saying is their brain isn't quite sure where the finger's actually at. So unless you're really looking at your finger, it's kind of confused, it's a little bit off of where it's at, and that's why it can affect fine motor problems. So those are the two things that I would test at home to see if that could potentially be affecting your child's fine motor problem. You can check for the Palmar Reflex. That's absolutely gonna affect fine motor coordination, and then you can also check to see what their proprioception is like and if they can touch their fingers over top of their head. Those are really the two things that I found that kids struggle with the most if they have fine motor problems, and if you correct those issues, their fine motor coordination gets a lot better. So that's all I have for you today. Share this with someone if you know someone that could use it, and otherwise I will see you guys here tomorrow.